So what Asa was talking about when he's talking about the culture war, we are in a culture war. They will let you have money, they will give you jobs, they'll give you a college degree, they give you all of those things, but they won't teach you about black history. Ain't that, they say, you ain't got no history, that stuff ain't nothing, then teach it to me. Teach me nothing then. Because they know that in that history is who you're going to be. Remember the thing I said? The future is something that you aspire for, is hopes, is inspiration, but there's nothing there. The present is coming into being, so nothing is finished or completed for you to model after. Only in the past, only in history, only in history are you able to get what you need to recreate yourself into what you need to be. And he's keeping us from doing that.
This is a story about Dinky, the Kufwa king, or the king of death translated from the Congo language. Dinky was an oracle and came to America from the Mandan kingdom of West Africa. Police, judges, slaves, the whole community was stepped to the side when Dinky was coming through. He knew of the unseen and he carried the powders, so nobody thought it was a good idea to mess with him. He wore a snakeskin around his neck with a petrified frog in one pocket and a dried lizard in the other. It was said by slaves and slave masters that he sold his soul to the devil. Post-Crusades and witch hunt Europeans were deathly afraid of the devil, so it made sense that they would fear a man who had no concept of the devil in that context. Black people in America are looking for an identity. We want to be so many things because we don't know what we are to begin with. So this is a piece of an aspect that I don't hear many talk about. Black people in America are primarily of West African and Native American descent, with many European admixture lineages within our majority African descent group. Countries like Congo, Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and parts of Cameroon and Niger were major sites of departure for future slaves. They took their culture with them on their sometimes permanent, sometimes temporary trips down through the Caribbean to the eastern coast of the Americas. In Haiti, Cuba, and Brazil, the agricultural and mining crops required so much work that slaves lived an average of 10 years, and a new shipment of slaves had to be brought in rather frequently. Slave-master ratio was 10-1, so supervision was much lower in the United States, where the ratio was 5-1. Cultural retention was much easier in the Caribbean and South America, while in the U.S., generational conditioning was much more prominent. Through the practice of voodoo in Haiti and the United States, hoodoo in the U.S. as well, Santeria in Cuba, Candomblé in Brazil, Obia in Jamaica, Sanse in Puerto Rico, people of those Yoruba, Akan, Fon, and Congo cultures retain many of their spiritual traditions by syncretizing or combining Christian and Catholic saints with the Orisha. In the United States, however, black people were distanced from the spiritual language that those of us in the Caribbean and South America were fortunate enough to retain. European British gave Christianity to their slaves through rape, torture, and that repeating cycle through generational conditioning left us with hoodoo as we know it today. Katrina Hazzard-Donald defines hoodoo as the indigenous, herbal, healing, and supernatural controlling spiritual folk tradition of the African American in the U.S. It is the reorganized remnants of what must have been a full-blown syncretized African-based religion among slaves in the southern United States. Scholars and even practitioners of African-based religions all over agree that hoodoo is not a religion, and none of us may ever know the magnitude of root work or conjure since slaves were killed for practicing unless it was in secret or in service to their masters. But the function of a belief system is to make sense of experience and reality. A historic view of hoodoo as a system of belief addresses every problem that African Americans have faced in the United States. spiritual, mental, and physical protection and healing, both reactive and proactive. By definition, Hoodoo is a religion based on those facts. Both during slavery and after, whites encouraged fear of both the Christian God and the Christian devil in their slaves to instill subservience. Too many slave rebellions during the early part of U.S. slavery involved poisoning of captors through the use of roots, powders, tinctures, and other sources of untraceable poison from nature, so the practice of what we now call hoodoo was outlawed. They went from being proactive in their struggle for liberation to waiting on Jesus. They started relying heavily on tools that helped them cope with the torture of slavery. There were many conjurers who continued to practice in secret, serving their people, or publicly in service to their oppressors, and they were compensated with food, alcohol, clothing, or from the slave masters time off from the plantation in some cases, and in rare cases, total exemption from field work. At the end of slavery, however, laws were enacted that restricted the practice of conjure and root work on the basis of fear that newly freed slaves would organize or perform rituals that were detrimental to their former slave masters. Those found practicing conjure without a medical license were fined, jailed, or killed. Whites began to enter the community and learn the cures that were so common among their former slaves. They in turn paid for medical licenses that allowed them to produce these cures wholesale and offer them in hospitals to white patients and prescribe them at their pharmacies. It wasn't for another 20 to 30 years after emancipation that former slaves would see a fragment of the wealth that they could earn from doing conjure work and offering healing and prosperity to clients, including white business owners, doctors, and their wives, as opposed to being tenant farmers or housekeeper nannies. After emancipation, black men and women could hardly find work to take care of their families. Factory workers made about $20 a month, and farmers could expect about $1.50 a week. Conjure workers like Dr. Buzzard, Aunt Carolyn died, and others could make more money in a day than black skilled laborers in a month. The position of respect that conjure workers had on the plantation followed them after slavery, and their profits only increased as time went on. Benjamin Rucker called himself Black Herman, and he was the highest paid magician of his time. He himself once cryptically prophesied that he would come through once every 7 years to stake his claim to immortality. A resourceful showman who engaged in secular techniques of magic, he simultaneously reinterpreted the broader universe in which African American spiritual practices had been incubated, utilizing conjure, healing, divination, and hoodoo practices as part of his show. Simultaneously in the South, black women root workers like Madam Wiley and Myrtle Collins out of Memphis, Tennessee, were achieving financial success by offering roots and spells to white businessmen and their wives, happy for the fact that they didn't have to slum it with black clients. They would order supplies from their work from white organizations like the Rosicrucians, the White Brotherhood, various curios both in America and overseas. This paints the picture that hoodoo and conjure work in the U.S. had already become a commodity within the world market. Europeans have had an adaptive relationship to indigenous cultures with magic components that began as fear and persecution and later developed into culturally appropriating those religions and morphing them into something more white. While European slave masters feared the power of hoodoo and voodoo, they also wanted to capture it for themselves. This dates back to their obsession with ancient Egypt at the turn of the century, while they were robbing the graves within the pyramids, eating and having sex with mummies, in an attempt to tap into the power of those cultural artifacts. Further back in the late 1600s and early 1700s, church clergymen in northern United States went on a mass witch hunt and burned more than 200 people at the stake for practicing witchcraft. During slavery, Africans were punished severely for calling on anyone other than Jesus, oftentimes to death. Any tools that could be used while off duty were banned for use, including fire on many plantations. It was so bad that whites wouldn't even allow slaves to keep fire within their homes. Many mothers and children died during the cold months because of this, and if a slave was caught with a fire in their home, they would be beat for sure and sometimes beat to death, and their homes closed up for good. As explained earlier, however, whites saw the opportunity in the conjure tradition or hoodoo to influence their circumstances for the advancement of their race.